Good evening and thank you all for joining us. My name is Komal and we are delighted to be here in collaboration with Roli Books to celebrate their newly published book, India Through Iconic Maps, authored by Deepti Anand, Sangamitra Chatterjee and Juhi Walia. Given Sarmaya's collection of maps across different periods and traditions, we were very happy when Deepti and Juhi reached out to us to collaborate to launch this book at the archive. So I would like to take this opportunity to quickly introduce you to Sarmaya Arts Foundation. Sarmaya, which means shared wealth in Urdu, is built around the private collection of Paul Abraham, a banker, history enthusiast, and art patron, and is led by him and his partner, award-winning designer Pavitra Rajaram. Sarmaya began as a digital museum in 2015 with the aim of making this private collection accessible to a wider audience. Over the years, we have expanded our interactions with our audience through both digital and on-ground programming, which includes exhibitions, talks, workshops, and also partnerships like the one today, all designed to deepen engagement with our culture and our history. In 2024, we moved into this beautiful space, which is designed and restored by award-winning firm Pavitra Rajaram Design, which we are very proud to call our home. And now, to tell us more about the publication that brings us together this evening, I would like to invite Priya Kapoor, director at Roli Books, to introduce the book.
Good evening, everyone. It's so lovely to see a packed room. On behalf of Roli, it's a pleasure to be here and to introduce India Through Iconic Maps. It's particularly special because we're here at Sarmaya at this very inspiring space. Some of the maps in the book actually come from their collection, and if you see, they've taken the pains to take a few that are in the book and otherwise as well from their collection. So I hope at the end of this evening, you'll be inspired to spend more time with the maps and of course the book as well. This is in many ways the most ambitious book that we've published at Roli. It brings together almost 250 extraordinary maps, many of them rare, never published before, and spanning nearly 800 years of the subcontinent's history. For us at Roli, what's been really exciting is that it's pushed the boundaries of publishing in India. We've approached it as a true collector's volume, almost museum-like in its quality. There are only 1,000 copies ever that are going to be published. It's a large format book, both in physical space and its ambition. It's designed to do justice to the richness of the maps that it holds. The production, the paper, the reproduction of the maps, everything has been thought through very carefully so that the experience of the book matches the depth that the authors have brought to it. The design was spearheaded by Vivek Sani. Many of you may know him as the founder of Kama Ayurveda, but before that, he is and was one of our India's greatest graphic designers, so we pulled him out of graphic design sabbatical to help us design the book. But beyond its scale and beauty, what stayed with me the most was the learnings that I was able to take from the book, especially the text that Sangamitra and Deepti put together. You can actually pick up the book from any map entry. The whole idea is that it's not linear. You can read map number 26 or 182 and still understand what they were trying to tell you about that particular moment, that map, those who may have commissioned it. Some of my favorite maps, though, are not the most intricate or visually striking, but ones that really carry the trace of human interaction. For example, imagine before Google Maps was around, you were an out-of-towner who came to Bombay, and as one should when you come to Bombay for the first time, you ask for directions to Swati Snacks. And you ask somebody on the road, how do I get there? And they pull out a piece of paper and they draw it out and they give you that chit and say, follow this and you'll reach there. Now imagine if some of these survive 250 years. There are two like that in this book. I'm not going to tell you more. I just hope that you get some time to, as I said, spend time with the book. I'm really looking forward to the conversation, and before I end, I just wanted to say that thank you, Paul and Sarmaya, for everything that you're doing. For somebody in publishing, especially in the world of like visual publishing, art and illustrated books, it's so important for us to have these spaces which work as references. They celebrate the kind of book that we do, but also are creating these collections that will help our publishing. Over to you, Pallavi, to introduce the panel.
Thank you everyone for coming and being here. I will now take some time to introduce our panelists for today. Deepti Anand, one of the authors of India Through Iconic Maps, is a heritage professional based in Mumbai with extensive experience in archiving, historical research, and storytelling. She is the co-founder of Past Perfect Heritage Management, established in 2016, an agency committed to preserving and promoting heritage for future generations. Then we have Samira Sheikh, an associate professor of history at Vanderbilt University. She is the author of Foraging a Region, Sultans, Traders and Pilgrims in Gujarat, 1200 to 1500, and co-editor of After Timur Left. Having recently completed a book on late Mughal Bharuch, she is now working on a book and exhibition on early modern mapping practices in India. She is currently the 5th Obaid Siddiqui Chair at the Archives at NCBS, Bangalore. Paul Abraham is the founder of Sarmaya and a banker with over 40 years of experience. A passionate art patron and collector, Paul has dedicated himself to preserving and celebrating the cultural heritage of the Indian subcontinent. Paul extends his cultural commitment as a member of the governing board of the Dakshina Chitra Museum in Chennai. Beyond the arts, he champions environmental causes as chairman of the Sanctuary Nation Foundation and was formerly vice president of the Bombay Natural History Society and served as president of the Hinduja Foundation. Paul sits on multiple boards, including Hinduja Hospital, Muthoot Finance, and Huron University's India Advisory Council. He is also co-founder of Sanctitas, an investment advisory firm. Our moderator for this panel is Benita Fernando. Benita is a Mumbai-based writer. She previously worked as a culture journalist with the Indian Express, the Mint Lounge, and Sunday Midday. In the last 15 years, she has extensively reported on art and design. She was the recipient of the first SAF Arts Journalism Grant in 2023, which led her to explore environment and nature-based themes in Indian contemporary and traditional art. She has also written on urban heritage and history, an interest that began in 2014 when she ran a blog for Dharavi Binale, a community art and science project selected by The Guardian as among the best city blogs around the world. Her enduring personal interest in history and design prompted her to report on maps of antiquity as well as contemporary cartographers, looking at the historical and political importance of mapmaking, and also the map as an object of design and artistry. Thank you so much for listening. We can now begin the panel discussion.
Hello everyone and good evening. So, in 1817, Lord Hastings, the then Governor General, stated that the Great Trigonometrical Survey would give the world a map that without parallel. It would be the most accurate, the most extensive, and the most advanced map of its time. And it was not a map of Britain. The Great Trigonometrical Survey of India would lay down the scientific foundation for the modern map of India that we still use for official purposes today. However, as our panelists here will agree, that before this map without parallel came into being, there were all these other maps, perhaps not as accurate, but were still a rich treasure trove of information. After all, a map is a device that allows you to imagine entire worlds as they existed at a particular time in history through just mere markings and symbols. And for all the extensive mapping of the Indian subcontinent and the Indian Ocean that the colonial powers were undertaking, we have to ask ourselves, how is India mapping itself? So we begin with the basics, right? Deepti, you as co-author of this book have brought together so many European and Indian maps in one volume, right? And I think in the course of your research, as you've been telling us, what was a major finding was that sometimes you have to be alert when you are looking at a map, because a map is not always a chart or a globe or an atlas. Sometimes a map could be a traditional Indian painting. So what is a map, Deepti? And more importantly, what all could be a map?
I love that we've started this discussion at a question that could last us 45 minutes if we.
Agreed.
Yeah. But I think, can you all, am I audible? Yeah. So this is actually a question we asked ourselves very often while we were also putting the book together. And I think it also came from the responses we got when we were looking for these maps, because I think the maps that Benita is also referring to, for instance, is the one that you see right there hanging. Is that a map or not a map? So when we went to a lot of archives, libraries ourselves, when we were looking for these, they were classified as paintings. They were classified under art. A lot of people didn't look at them necessarily as cartography, like just devices of cartography or mapping in the first place. So I feel like we often ourselves wondered whether it would be right to include them as part of a volume that, say, charts the story of India through maps. But I think we then went back to the basics, like Benita said. What was a map meant to do? It was, I think, meant to tell you or sort of give you a visual storytelling of a spatial arrangement. So you had area maps, you had regional maps, you had world maps. And then when we saw the cosmographies, they were maps of the universe. I think it was also a product of understanding where you were at that point in time. And I think when we look at the Jain cosmographies, for instance, it was all that we knew. We imagined, tried to figure out what our place in the universe was, and therefore we were situated in a middle world, which I think if we pulled out would be right in the center. The circle that you see of the man in the center was where we thought we were placed, above which there were 7 levels of heaven, below which there were 7 levels of hell. And I think you see like the hell also depicted on that side of the map, which is like as you went down, the torture and the level of torture increased. So I feel like it's also a product of the centers of learning at the time, the kind of sort of questions we were asking, and this was what we knew until the age of discovery begins. We discover the seas, we discover the oceans, want to reach land. So it's also like an evolution of curiosity that then leads to an evolution in map making. And I feel like therefore it becomes very important for us to sort of, like I said, answer that question differently and not look at scientific maps as the only kind of maps.
Yeah, because we're very used to
yeah.
a very Western idea of what a map is, or even the subject of
Yeah.
the map, right?
So I think before I give it, the one thing I think that I'd like to sort of also point out is not necessarily Western. Because I think while we think of Western maps as scientific maps, we have enough examples in the book and otherwise in the world, which they called, which was spiritual mapping at their end as well, which was the Mappai Mundi. And they had biblical references within their maps. I think if you're pulling that out, then that will come up as well. But they also at one point were doing the same thing that our cosmographies were doing. I think it's just the perception that they made only scientific maps is wrong. Everyone was sort of exploring what the world was looking like at the same time. So it's not Western or anything of that sort. Like I said, it's just an evolution of map making across the world, West and Eastern. Both places, yeah.
And Samira, would it be right to say that this has been also your experience in your ongoing research of non-European Indian maps that were being produced in Gujarat and Rajasthan, pre-colonial that is? You have spoken about, the importance of recognizing the map not just as a product, but also mapping as a practice. How do we approach the map? And so could you tell us more about this based on your own research?
Sure. One of the reasons I was so excited by this wonderful volume with 254 maps, which is which is a workout to lift. It is so beautifully designed. So I have to congratulate Rolly for putting it together so well. But what is so exciting about it is that it juxtaposes and puts within the same frame European mappings of India, Indian mappings of India, and everything in between. So there's hybrid maps as well, sort of Indian maps made in Western style. And what has ended up happening as a result of this book is a really refreshing sense that what we think of as paintings, or was often classified as paintings, in this book are considered seriously as maps. And I think what happens when you place these sort of European style maps that are intended to be aggregators of information, kind of empirical information, alongside works that are aggregators of other kinds of experiences, other kinds of human experiences, other kinds of ways of being in the world, then you recognize that the emphasis needs to be not necessarily only on the product, but on the process as well. So what happens, and this is where I feel the book leads us to this thought, that what happens when we think about not just maps as objects as they end up being, but what is the whole process of mapping? And then you realize that if you sort of broaden the idea to the activities concerned in mapping, then you recognize that each product is the only the end point of surveying, of philosophizing about your place in the world, about thinking about measuring routes, thinking about places that might evoke emotions or nostalgia, thinking about ways of understanding your relationship to the divine. And so there are all these multiple ways in which people have mapped the world and the cosmos. And by placing those with respect to India in the same book, I think we are both giving respect to all these ways of understanding space and place, but also emphasizing the activities that go into the world of mapping. So I'm really excited that you've done that.
Yeah. And one of the things, Samira, that I think I've been interested in are also the devotional maps, right? Something we don't necessarily always think about, like with the cosmography, the relation of human to the cosmos. We also have devotional maps that are not perhaps used in the same sense that we might use a contemporary map as we know it. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
So, I mean, what is the most basic way in which you use maps, right? I mean, for me, when I was walking from Fort to here, I used Google Maps to get from A to B, right? You might find that you also maybe need to know what are the political boundaries that confine you. So where are the borders that you can cross, and what are the borders that you cannot cross, that you may need special permission to cross. We have, in our modern way of being, we have a number of ways of encountering maps. The most functional is just from getting us from A to B. But that is, of course, even getting us from A to B. If you consider a metro map, for instance, that doesn't necessarily correspond exactly to places on the earth measured with specific and accurate representations, right? They are a stylized representation of the points on a globe or in a specific circuit. So when we think about religious maps, and here you have this gorgeous example of a Shatrunjaya Pata, I think what happens is you've got to think about ways in which pilgrims might encounter and use and think about their relationship to this map, for instance, that you see here. So what you've got here is a representation of the Jain sacred site of Shatrunjaya, which is in Saurashtra in Gujarat. And what you see here is the path that a pilgrim would take while climbing the mountain of Shatrunjaya to get to the peak, but on the way they would encounter various subsidiary temples. They would encounter certain kinds of non-Jain temples as well. Shatrunjaya Patas often have like a dargah being represented or a goddess temple being represented. They will often show the geography of the place. So they'll often show the trees that you would see, and often very carefully drawn. So if you look at the bottom of the map, those trees, and I haven't looked at this particular pata very carefully, but they will often be very accurate in botanical detail. You will also see, and look at the left-hand strip of this map, you will see a strip of blue, which is none other than a representation of the sea, because Shatrunjaya is very close to the sea, to the port of Bhavnagar and Goga. And so you see that what is presented in rectangular form here is a stylization of the town, the pilgrimage place of Shatrunjaya, but retaining a lot of its actual features, right? So what is the use of this to a pilgrim? First, they know through this map that these are the important sites I should travel through when I'm doing the pilgrimage. And that means I will be doing the pilgrimage in the right way to get the maximum amount of merit and benefit. But there may be people who can't travel to Shatrunjaya, who are ill or old or who have always wanted to, or who maybe are traveling and don't have the opportunity to go to Shatrunjaya, or may have been there once but want to relive the experience. What this map does, it acts as a memory aid. It acts as a way of reliving the emotions of devotion during the time they took the pilgrimage. And it can also, for people who can't ever go there, give them a strong sense that this is almost like a meditative practice. If you follow the path of the pilgrim, you will achieve some of the benefits of the actual pilgrimage. So I think, religious maps work in a way that is functional. So it's wrong to say that painted maps or that non-Cartesian maps are somehow less functional. They are functional, but they may not get you, as effectively from Fort to Sarmaya as I was able to do with the map on my phone.
True, true. And now that you're expanding our idea of what the map is and what it can do, Paul, I want to ask you about the Poittinger's tabula. That is a fact. We have a print of it at the back. You can see it later. That is something that Paul personally loves. And you've been telling us about the shape of a map. A map is not necessarily always a rectangle or a globe, right? And about how the shape can tell you a lot about the civilization or the culture that produced it and the knowledge that comes from the map. So take us through one of your favorite maps, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the rendering of India in any form, I think one of the earliest was probably in the 4th or 5th century BC. And then, of course, Alexander came all the way to India. And that kind of opened up, their knowledge of not just by the sea, even by land. And this started in the Roman system as a record of the road network that would carry a courier and, how you got from point A to point B over land largely. And they used to keep amending it. And this particular version is a 12th century creation of the last version which they apparently know about, which was the 5th century version. And the original is kept in the Vienna Bibliothek. It's absolutely fragile, so they allowed me to see and access it, and then they gave me the high-res image. And it's one single scroll format, so it's about 22, 23 feet long and about 1.5 feet wide, exactly as it is shown here. And it's all kind of in tatters at the edges. But the fascinating thing is, the extreme left is Hispania, which is, this is just 1/5 of the map. The entire thing is kept there for you to have a look. The extreme left is Hispania. That was their known, boundary of the Roman Empire. And the extreme right is India. And you can see Muziris shown there. So the whole festival which is going on in Kochi, it was initially started as the Muziris festival. So that was the reason why it was called the Muziris festival. And in their records, Muziris was one of the finest emporios of, ancient times, including in the Sangamira literature. Michiri, as it was called, was also referred to very actively. And what's interesting is they actually have a temple to Augustus actually mentioned there and shown there. So to me, this is an amazing a document, and it's also, when you look at it at this level, the perspective is like that, because it's a road system. So you kind of say, I'm going from here to VT, and then I'm also going from here to Bombay Gym. So it's like this. So there's one road going this way and one road going that way. It's not necessary that the perspective is entirely correct or the distances are exactly mapped. But to think that in that first or second century, they were aware of India, and I am quite certain, because of what you find in books like the Periplus, they've been coming, for years. In the old Egyptian records, Ophir is mentioned, very often historians say Ophir is India, because you get teak and peacocks and all from this fabled land called Ophir. So even when the Portuguese came to India, they were floating up and down the African east coast, and they met a Buju Bhai near, who actually guided them to India. That's how first Vasco da Gama landed up in Calicut in 1498. So yeah, this map is particularly special because it's one of the oldest surviving records of ancient, featuring ancient India, or a couple of locations in ancient India.
Yeah, and interesting that Muziris is mentioned on this long scroll-like map that just opens out, right? And I think because it was one of the major ports as well, I think, which is why it features over here. And we have over here, for example, the triangle of India's peninsula right overhead. If you see the outline that goes over there, that Paul has installed over here. So I think there was a major interest in India's coastline, and I think there was, I think eventually that was what was being mapped extensively, right? And Muziris was there, and then there was Surat, and then there was Chaul, long before Bombay even featured on these maps. So, question for you, Deepti, right? Because so many maps in your book as well feature, I think, the maritime navigation, something we don't necessarily think about today as being the most important thing when it comes to mapping. So I want you to tell us a bit about, how important were nautical charts. And I know, Samira, you've also been looking into the same thing, so I'll come to you next. So Deepti, could you just take us through this, the connections between maritime navigation and mapping the peninsula?
So, they were the base, and I think which is why when we said so, I think section 2 of our book, in fact, entirely is about the age of discovery. It's when the oceans are discovered and everyone's at it to figure out. They're stumbling upon discoveries. I think, like Paul said, for instance, you meet an Indian merchant and he guides you to India and you discover a land. And I think in most of the maps that you see eventually also that are made, I think what it did for me also personally during writing this book was it made me really proud of India, because the way they describe the country is just, I think there's envy in every single descriptor. The way they talk about the Golconda mines, the way they talk about the rich harbors, the prime harbors. So I think it's just once India sort of started to be mapped, and I think you sort of figured out that there is this entire land of riches available to us. And this one's, for instance, stunning. If you sort of zoom in to India, you have all of these large paragraphs of just describing what you can find in our country. And I feel like the sea was, of course, the route to get there, and we have a lot of nautical charts that sort of give you the depth soundings, the fact that you're going to encounter a rock here, sort of when you're approaching Bombay, for instance. I think we have a nautical chart in the selection. It's like, okay, this is how the island is going to look. So I feel like the nautical charts were literally sort of the base up till you reach the land. So I think I have this really strange analogy of how the sea was first the land, and then you discover the land, and then you sort of start navigating the land within. So I feel like it really, and I think what Samira is also working on, which I think she can elaborate on further, but we have a few examples in the book of these Kutchi sort of nautical charts, maritime charts. And those were, we sort of had this impression of the fact that it was just Europeans who were dominating the sea, getting from one place to the other, but the Indian Ocean was literally governed, and nobody knew the Indian Ocean better than the Kutchi navigators.
Could you tell us what you're seeing over here, Deepti?
Yeah, I think so. Here, for instance, they kept something called the Malamni Pothi, and those were essentially their notes on how you navigate the Indian Ocean. So again, while we may not think of as conventional maps, they literally told you how to get to one place, and there are descriptions of what you're going to see on the way. How do you get to Africa? Like he said, I think everything has been noted down. It just doesn't take the form and shape of a map, but I think it's various instances in history completely confirm that no one could have reached India if not for our own people. No one could have gotten into India, any part of India, if not for our own sort of knowledge. And I think Samira can elaborate a lot more on the nautical charts as well, since I think she's doing.
Yeah, there's a Gujarati map that I think, could we pull that up, Juhi, please?
Okay, so we are at that point of the evening when we start to blame the Gujus, right? Responsible for Vasco da Gama. So what are we looking at here? And maybe I'll just stand because it's just easier to tell you what's going on. So I've spent a lot of time looking at Gujarati maps, and not necessarily because I've been paid by the richest people in India, but because Gujarat's long coastline just meant that Gujaratis traded a lot. And when Gujaratis trade a lot, they have to have some method of navigating. Now, what were those methods of navigating? And the answer started to come to me when I was a PhD student many years ago. And someone sent me in an envelope. This is, I was procrastinating from writing my actual dissertation. Someone sent me an envelope which contained a very intriguing map and some pages of text which I couldn't at all understand in the beginning. I just looked at them blankly and I just wondered what they were. It took me a year to figure out what was going on. And the map turned out to be a map of the coastline of Gujarat, and the text turned out to be instructions on navigating from the southernmost point of the Saurashtra Peninsula, which is the island of Diu, to Surat. And the way you navigate is you navigate by the stars, right? So you navigate for a certain length, certain distance by the North Star. There's other constellations that are mentioned, and it's what a navigator needs. It's the basic information that a pilot or navigator needs to make that journey from Diu to Surat. Similarly, there was a stretch from Aden to Jeddah, which was described in words without an actual map accompanying it. And then what was, in fact, for me at that time, the most exciting, and I'm talking about 25 years ago, there was a list of, it looked just like a sort of shopping list or a laundry list. I could see numbers and I could see names. And when I finally figured out and transcribed all the names, it turned out to be a list of over 100 Indian Ocean ports, starting in Mogadishu and ending up in, this isn't actually the one I'm talking about, but I will get to this in a minute. But it was a list of ports of the Indian Ocean, each of which had their latitude value written alongside it. So the numerals were all the latitude values. And it took me a while to figure out how latitude values were calculated. And Juhi, if you want to go back to the previous slide, there we go. So when you have the latitude value and you're sailing, say, from Mombasa to Mumbai, all you need to have is the latitude of Mombasa and the latitude of Mumbai. And as long as you can keep your ship on that same latitude, eventually you will hit Mumbai, right? So this works very well on an east-west journey. It doesn't work so well when you have a north-south journey. And so you need a different technology for the north-south journey. Now, what we have here is a long scroll map, and in that sense, it's quite similar to the Poitinger map, because this would have been rolled up and possibly taken by pilots on board ships. And this is the journey from Aden at the southern tip of the Red Sea to Jeddah, which is the great port going to the Hajj, but also great trading port. And this shows you, so it's a beautiful map, and it's not clear whether it was ever used. It's in the Royal Geographical Society in London. But what this shows you is so that is the eastern coast of the Red Sea up top, and this is the the western coast of the Red Sea. So you're seeing Ethiopia, Somalia, and Bab el-Mandeb, which is the mouth of the Red Sea over here, right? So you have to change your orientation and think that this has east on top. So it has all the ports listed. It has a lot of the port silhouettes listed. So you can see that, a particular port has a hill or has a particular building. Then you have what looks like rum lines, which run between ports and which tell you not the distance between the ports, but the time it takes you to sail from one port to another. So you have now quite a lot of data with which to handle a north-south coastline as well, right? So in combination, so basically maps for Gujarati and Kutchi navigators were made very customized to the actual circuit that they traveled. If they were traveling just along the coastline of India, then they would carry maps that were customized for that purpose, right? If they were traveling in the Red Sea, then they might carry something like this, although this is probably a very slightly fancy version of what they might have carried. Or they might, if they were very experienced, they wouldn't even need the map. They could just have it in the form of written instructions that sail for 3 hours by the pole star, and once you get to that point, depending on the time of the year, then maybe head west, looking at some other star or constellation, and you should get to your destination. If you don't, you're in trouble. So a lot of information, very much customized to the patrons or users' needs, and that is how many of these navigational charts work. There were also wind roses. There's a huge amount of information that sailors on both coasts, Western and Indian coasts, used, and we are still at the very early stages of figuring out how they all worked.
Go ahead.
Just to add to what you were saying, Samira, and to keep the, continuing with the gujus, there's a, art form which is called Matani Pachedi, right? And Matani Pachedi has the, goddesses who are manifestations of Shakti, the female form, and each of them has a Vahan. And there's one goddess which is Sokotra Mata, and the Vahan is a ship. And Sokotra is an island south of Yemen, And Sokotra used to be, from ancient times, the pit stop for ships going back and forth, often to stop for a break to pick up fresh water, So now they have discovered caves in Sokotra where there have been people coming and offering prayers to little deities. And obviously, at that time, getting to Sokotra was the first big, kind of milestone. And you prayed to Sokotra Mata to take you there safely. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's lovely. And in this map, I do like the many kinds of ships that you can see, right? It's is very beautiful in the way it's been represented. And I'm also amazed, Samira, that people could travel this way when we literally get lost with Google Maps over here telling us, go here and go there, but they were traveling with all these kinds of things. But I also want to ask you then a little bit about the figure of the cartographer, and who was making these maps, whether they were for Indian patrons or for European officials, perhaps. So a couple of questions then, So was the cartographer the same as the person who actually made the maps? Yeah. Deepti, do you want to try this?
So it was, again, depending on the time period. So I think if we go back in time, it was a group of people. It was a complete community that was keeping sort of map making alive. It was a lot of times the travelers who actually traveled India on foot or who maintained accounts, which were then sent back to Europe. And then, there are various sort of illustrations of a cartographer, map maker, sitting in a room with a globe and like a pile of paper. So he was essentially reading these traveler accounts and trying to piece together the map back.
He's never been to this.
Never been to India. And which is where the inaccurate maps of India that we know of today, of course, at that point in time, they were thought of as accurate. So I think the word accuracy is also subjective. So what we call inaccurate today was them literally piecing together these journeys as they read about them. And in a lot of these maps, you will see some dotted lines which also show you the routes that the traveler traveled. And they have, even in cartouches, sort of spoken about that it's based on, say, this traveler's account, etc. So he was the one, say, putting together that map. And then there was, of course, there were engravers who were there were etching artists. So there were many people involved in map production. And I think also as maps became objects of desire, like you said, of patrons in itself first, they were only sort of produced for that purpose. But then once they became publicly available, and with the Industrial Revolution, then map production, there are papers and papers talking about the popularity of maps and atlases, and which is when all of these colorful decorative atlases start coming into play. And just the map making business. So like, I think we've read a lot of accounts where, say, the British didn't have they were late to the party because they didn't have great map makers, and they're talking about how we don't have the talent to make good maps, whereas the other people have figured it out. So I feel like just that entire community, so as we have the demand increasing and therefore people getting into the map making profession, and the coloring, for instance, that you see on a lot of these maps is not contemporary, it happened much later. Because we've also read descriptions about how actual colorists and artists at the time would need to know how to make the pigments to actually be able to color those then. So this would also be a product of. So I feel like the maps we see today have gone through years of also just improvements from the time they were made. They would have perhaps been made very differently, and the maps we see today have also had a journey, which is also beautiful in its own sense of the map as an object. It was, I think, and then when scientific mapping took over, again, still a community thing, because you had surveyors on field, actually doing the mapping, recording them in journals, these many, I think exactly like Samira said, taken these many footsteps, this is what I'm observing, this is the latitude, longitude, the measurements with the equipment, and then again, that information went back to Europe to piece together that information into a map, and then those were printed differently. So again, it was always many people sort of coming together to create what we take for granted today. And I think these scientific maps that we talk about were literally also the base of what the GPS was created on the basis of. So the scientific mapping that happened in India from the 1800s literally is the most sort of scientific accurate mapping that ever took place in the world, like historically. So I think, and wouldn't have happened without, like I said, a ton of people getting into surveying, mapping, and the creation of maps.
True, and I know you said accuracy is subjective, but I think we have the case of, things that were never there, and you have one such map that is displayed over there, right? Could you tell us more about that one, Paul? I think he just showed that one.
I guess, there are maps there, and my wife is standing next to the pillar, and I think she got inspired by the map there to make this beaten brass sculpture on top. And if you see, the initial maps that we had were largely maps of the coastline, because most of the trade was happening all the way from, Surat and Bharuch of ancient times. The Greeks and Romans called it Baragiza, and down to, Muziris and around the corner, around the Cape to places like Archimede. So their knowledge of the coast was very strong. So if you see that map, you can see literally a port every 100 kilometers, and you actually have a key there which shows the many colonial powers who had stations or factories, as they were called, at each of those locations, including the Danish. That particular map is an older version. It's a 17th century version. And I, just like Deepti said, I think that was a classical example of storytelling.
Yeah.
The lighting is
Okay, can we put off this light?
even these lights are a bit harsh to see.
Yeah, we have a bit of a challenge, maybe like the old cartographers had. We have a photographer here who needs the light, and a videographer who needs the light. Yeah, so this is the map which is there in the corner, and you see that little lake formation there? Yeah, it's called Chiamai, this thing. And it's, of course, as you can see, totally out of whack in terms of the perspective. But somebody said, there are rivers originating from this point and all that. So they put an imaginary lake there. And somewhere along the way, someone enlightened somebody else, and cartographer, and said, boss, that was all storytelling. There is no such lake. So suddenly this lake disappears. But for a long time, in all versions of maps, from all the ateliers across Europe, you had this lake. But if you can show that map, is that there? Yeah, this one. You can zoom it in a little bit. So you see this? This was one of the earlier maps which showed all the port towns. And if you go down, there. So you see that? There's English, Danish, of course, if you read your Asterix comics, Gal is French, and Hollandi, which is, of course, the Dutch and Portugal. And all of those have flags at each of those ports, so you can actually figure out which ports. But see how busy it is. So the port activity was incredible. There was action happening, and this action has been happening not during colonial times. This action has been happening for 2,000 years. If you actually see, that book is kept there in that shelf, Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. Ports all the way from Berenike in the Red Sea to Muziris and Archimede are detailed. It's a log. We don't know who made it. It's an anonymous log of every port on the way where they would stop, which port was to pick up, which port was to drop, which port was an entrepot. All that information is there, and that's 2,000 years old. We have another book called Crossings by an author called Federico Romanis. He actually traveled from the Nile to Berenike, which is a 7-day walk. And there are wadis on the way. In the caves, there are actual details. I am going to India. I have been sponsored by so-and-so. I am going to get this from India. And there's a famous Venetian contract which actually details what all is he committed to go and bring from India. So it's just amazing.
And Paul, you have collected so many maps to support your collection of. Maps do form a sizable part of your collection, I think.
Yes.
So I want to ask you, when it comes to collecting maps, we usually think of collecting those that are somewhat antiquated, right? We don't think of collecting, of acquiring, say, a modern Indian map. Not always, right? Is there a reason you think that you favor, older maps of India rather than the more contemporary ones?
Well, I think my journey with maps started grounded in history. I started my collecting journey with coins, numismatics. I grew up in Delhi, and even 100 years ago, many places which are listed on the coin as a mint are not named the same today. So there are many names. So if you have to get a few of these maps, and if you see there's that big one there and there's one on the left, those are the kind of maps one used to identify those cities. So they would have that name 100 years ago, 200 years ago, which are mentioned on the mint. So that's where it started. But as with all of these journeys, after a while you kind of lose your mind, and you're collecting the genre itself. But yeah, that's where it started. It was grounded in history.
Sure.
As an aid to that collecting journey. But I found the older maps so much prettier. They were not just pure clinical things. They had cartouches, they had beautiful visuals of the place. Like if you see that map there, you actually have the visual of the city, and you have visual of the people who you see and the dress they wore and all of that on that map. So that's beautiful. It's not a clinical ting ting ting, only lines going back and forth.
Sure. And because you mentioned cartouches, I could see Deepti smile over there. So tell us more about the cartouches. The last couple of questions before we open it up to the audience. So this one is Reynolds' map, yes? Yeah.
I think But I think I'll just speak about the cartouches overall. This one, of course, I think Samira will also have something to say about. But I think what Paul was saying, for instance, the storytelling of the old maps, I feel like we somewhere forgot while making maps as to the fact that we also needed to show where these were taking us. So I feel like a lot of the iconography sort of told us those things. And I think the cartouche, for instance, did that beautifully. I think in this case, of course, this was once they had cracked what India was looking like accurately, and therefore British supremacy is all over this cartouche. They have Britannia, I think there's on a bale of cotton, which was what they took from India. There's an opium sort of, I can't see it, But I think in a lot of these cases, the cartouches told you stories in themselves. And I think storytelling of the older maps is what is so beautiful. I think, do you have that mythical map, the Orion one, the one where he's at Calicut? So if you see that map, you look at it and you'll be like, what is happening here? It's a map of the Calicut, approaching Calicut, and this is Orion, and the story, of course, he's a mythical poet as well. But I think it's also linked to him carrying away the riches, and he was supposed to be robbed, and they're sort of, in a way, describing the port of Calicut and the dangers that surrounded the approach to Calicut or going away with it. So I feel like there was a lot of forms of storytelling that were infused into map making that today can be analyzed and which is why I feel like looking at maps as records in themselves, there is so much to say. But I think, Samira, do you have something to add?
So the cartouche, is it one of your favorite elements in maps, Samira? Is it or?
Well, cartouches. Well, I kind of let's have a look at the Renal, if you would.
This is Reynolds' map of Hindustan, right?
So James Rennell was a English surveyor and cartographer who made a very detailed survey of Bengal, and then he made also a very detailed survey of which ended up in this map of Hindustan. And the first edition of this comes out in 1782, as I recall. Now, what you see in this cartouche, and Juhi, if you just zoom in a little bit, so you're seeing a lot of elements of impending empire over here. Yeah, this is still kind of very early empire, but we're we're already starting to see it. So we see the Brahmin bowing before the embodiment of Britannia and offering the Shastras. Remember, Warren Hastings is the one who codifies the Hindu and Muslim law. And so we see the Brahmins very carefully giving the Shastra to Britannia. We see the lion, which is the embodiment of Britain, and we also, of course, see the ship, which is the emblem of British sovereignty. We see a lot of labor going on over here, and this labor is again now configured to be in the service of now. This British Empire has not yet happened. This is still the East India Company, right? But we see that because now, as you remember from school, 1757 is the Battle of Plassey, and Bengal is now ruled by the East India Company. So we are kind of seeing a lot of those elements over here, and this cartouche becomes by the 17th century a kind of really important feature of European maps. Now I don't have and if you want to zoom back out and we see the whole of the map. Now, how does Rennell, now this is before the Great Trigonometric Survey, yeah, where Sir George Everest and others, Colonel Lambton, do a whole series of triangulations to map the whole of the British dominions. So this is before that. This is well before that, 1782. So how does Rennell collect all this information, even about areas that are not yet under British control? So that's been something I'm very interested in. And so what, again, I'm going to take you to Gujarat. Surprise, surprise. But so one of the things that happens is that Rennell, in his memoir, which he writes in the 1790s, he says the most detailed map of Gujarat was made by a Brahmin named Sadanand, who lived in the city of Cambay. And I am using Sadanand's map as the basis of my rendition of the region of Gujarat. Now, this actually is from 1782, and this is before he has seen Sadanand's map. So what you're seeing of Gujarat here is pretty sketchy, and there's not much detail to it. Yeah, it's basically, as Paul said, the coastal towns are mentioned, but there's not much detail inside of the map. So what does who is Sadanand and what does he do? Now we're talking about scientific mapping, right? Now, even to make a map like this, you need to do some surveying. Some science has to come to represent in rectangular form a hill, a pathway, the sea, and so on. So some understanding, some version of surveying and some stylization has to be done to create that. What Sadanand does is really remarkable. He's a Brahmin, he's an astrologer, and he's sitting in the city of Cambay there. So it is around late 1770s. The British have captured the city of Cambay and a few cities in South Gujarat, but most of the rest of Gujarat is either controlled by the Marathas or by various princely states. The Mughals have withdrawn from Gujarat. So in this situation, how is a man called Sadanand collecting information? I wish I had the image, I don't think I gave it to you, of 400 towns within the area of Gujarat, depicted on an accurate latitude-longitude map, and including a cartouche in which he has a self-portrait.
Oh,
Yeah.
nice.
So what Sadanand does, and here's where, the question of science and European supremacy and so on kind of is blown to bits. Because Sadanand is an astrologer. Now remember, astrologers, in order to make your Janam Kundli, need the place where you're born. And they need the coordinates of the place where you're born. Because they connect that to the astral happenings of the time when you're born. So they need time, they need place, they need coordinates. What is that but the raw materials for a map? So every astrologer in India had in their hands the raw materials for making maps. But they didn't necessarily make them. But in this case, Sadanand decides to not only collect a vast amount of detail about over 400 places in Gujarat, but to figure out how to place them on a lat-long grid. And then he presented this to the governor, the British resident of Camden, a man named Charles Mallet. And Charles Mallet, somehow, I don't know the route by which it reaches Rennell, but it does reach Rennell, and Rennell is very impressed. And Rennell, in the subsequent editions of this map, really is able to fill in the details of the Gujarat part. So what we see as being British scientific knowledge is actually preceded in many cases by Indians mapping their own territories and doing it in very elaborate ways and with very sophisticated knowledge, not just of what is now fashionably called Indian knowledge systems, but also of Western knowledge systems, including the convention of the cartouche. Right? So
That was.
maybe I'll come back and we'll talk about Sadanand some other
But
time.
do we know what happened to Sadanand's, Samira? Do we know what happened to Sadanand's map? The one that Rennell based?
It's in the British Library.
Okay.
Oh, no, Rennell's map is not. The one Rennell used is not. But he made another version of it, which is in the British Library.
Sure. But we are saying that I think Rennell did use a number of maps made by locals at that time, but we don't know what happened to all of them, right?
No.
Yeah. I think that's all the time we have for our discussion.
I'm just giving another example of all these.
Bring the mic.
The tiger hunt and they're all basically images which tell you when you go there, this is what you could be doing. That's the kind of place you will be seeing, etc., etc. So this is ruins of old Delhi. That's the British residency in Hyderabad. So obviously it's not that old, but it's interesting that they, create at the festival in Odisha, the Jagannath festival. So.
And also the elephants, right? Paul, so many maps with elephants. They were obsessed with the creature, I think.
Yeah. But also, I think to add to what he was saying, I think one of the important components also of putting these visuals on the maps was to there was one map I remember that we found, which for the longest time was a regular map of Calcutta. And then there was this tiny little, in the cartouche, it said that it was made by the Society for Diffusion of Useful Knowledge. And then we were like, what is this society? And then we just went into figuring out what that is. And it turns out it was an actual society in London that was formed to disseminate knowledge to people, because a lot of maps and all geographical knowledge, etc., was for the elites for the longest time and not for the people. So this society was collecting all of this data and also making maps themselves to share with people, because they wanted the people of England to be proud of their colonies and showcase the riches of the colonies that they were also occupying. And I think it's just fascinating ways of discovering why some of these things were also on the maps, and that again had a lot of these images like this one has.
This one is exquisite.
Yeah.
We have it behind over there. Yeah. Great. Open it to the audience. Yes? Yeah.
Okay, we have
No, I just want to mention that in the medieval ages, years ago, when ships several hundred years ago during the... Is it working?
Yeah.
When ships raided each other, the most important thing on a ship that you conquered or won over were the maps. Because in those years, several hundred years ago, people's knowledge obviously of what the world was about, and more importantly, where to trade and where to colonize, was extremely important. And those were the most sought after things on board in any ship that you attacked.
So it was not just ship, by the way. In the colonial system, a map was something that you guarded with your life.
Correct.
And kingdoms would guard maps because maps gave away.
Yeah. And I think not only maps, map makers also.
Yes.
Because there were a lot of colonies that poached map makers from, commissioning, that poached map makers because they had the knowledge. So I think we have a lot of instances of people shifting affiliations to a different sort of thing and saying, oh, we need that map maker. We also have spies who sat in the Portuguese colonies just absorbing all of the information that the Portuguese were taking, and they were like, okay, now I'm going to go back to the French and give them all the information so that they can. So a lot of this, it was absolutely the topmost priority when you didn't know what was around you. I think, like we said, we take it for granted today, everything, it's all available, but yeah.
But Samira, what is interesting also, what you said about behind all the scientific maps of the West was actually Indian Pandits who actually they learned all this knowledge from, is also similar to Vasco da Gama getting the credit for the sea route to India when actually to some Gujarati who helped him locate how to get here.
They like the mic this way.
I want to ask regarding that, like the Shatrunjay maps, and there are other spiritual like Vishwarupa maps of the cosmos and all. Would you consider, say, the game of snakes and ladders also as a map, especially the really old ones, which were very, very elaborate cosmologies? And you had detailed locus, and there were paths to navigate, and those that the snakes that dragged you down and all of that thing. But would you consider that a sort of map?
So, since I've got the mic, I will take the liberty of answering. I'll give you my take on that question. I think you can have a maximalist definition of maps, and you can have a minimalist definition. And my solution to that problem is to think about what is being mapped. So, what is that game of snakes and ladders trying to map? And once we think of it as an activity which requires a certain comprehension of cosmology, of heaven, of punishments, and so on, if it's a cosmology being mapped here, and that would, I think, fit in a more maximalist end of the spectrum. And but why not? Mapping is something we universally do. Unless people have serious neurological difficulties, it's a universal human activity. We all map constantly because we have to map our place in the world as we just walk around. So we can think of that as being, part of what mapping is. Why not? But then you may have a more strict understanding of mapping as being something that is either terrestrial or connected with function, and then you would kind of want to restrict that. So it's really based on your point of view.
On a lighter way, it is something that established a moral compass, because the snake and ladder game was initially meant to be teaching you good deeds took you up, bad deeds brought you down.
But it's also chancy.
Yeah?
It's so chancy. So it's nothing more like you're completely.
Yeah. Yes.
Hello. Well, Samira, Yeah, it's me. Well, before I ask a question, I just want to make a point that I think it is necessary to emphasize, especially after trigonometrical mapping takes place, that all those maps had one compelling interest: to access revenue. And throughout India, they are doing this very, very meticulously because they want to extort maximum revenue from this country. But that apart, coming to Sadanand, I think you made a very interesting point that he was an astrologer. Clearly, it presumes a certain knowledge of astronomy, right? So what is the extent to which astronomical knowledge has spread into the coastal towns of India amongst these maritime communities? And thus the question also arises, what is the linkage between the history of astronomy and the history of navigation? And, India gave the world the decimal system. So all these clearly are very closely linked. And, I just thought if you can just elaborate on this. Thank you.
Thanks for giving me the chance to talk about one of my hobby horses. In the 14th century, in the city of Bharuch, which you know very well, there was a Jain Muni named Mahendra Suri who wrote a text called the Yantra Raja. And the Yantra Raja was a kind of paean of praise to a new technology that had just come to India. And of course, all new technologies come first to Gujarat, right? So it had come from the West, from the Islamic world to India. This is the 14th century, okay? So we have, I think this is during the time of Muhammad bin Tughlaq. So what is this Yantra Raja and why does Mahendra Suri write this text? This object that he writes a text about is an astrolabe. And it is an astrolabe is a very simple little tool which, you'll often see even now, in antique shops. They're made of brass and they allow you to calculate your position with respect to astral objects, whether it's the pole star or asterisms of different kinds. So this little device was something that revolutionized both the practice of astronomy and the practice of mathematics in 14th century India. And the Jains of Gujarat were the ones who first adopted it from the Perso-Islamic world. This becomes very popular now. And so we have a lot of astrolabes from Western India which are being produced and they are still being produced. Now they're more curious. But that knowledge of how to find your place both on land and on sea, so there's a slightly different variant called a land astrolabe, that really revolutionizes everything. So this is where, again, you've got the potential to make maps, which is there in mathematical, astronomical terms, but the connection with the fiscal is not yet established, because so fiscal means the collection of revenue, the collection of taxes. Now every ruler needs to be able to calculate the parcel of land in order to collect the appropriate taxes from it. So you would think that all kings need maps. But the problem is that we have very few examples of fiscal maps from India from any period before the British. So how were rulers collecting and calculating maps accurately? Was astronomy and mathematics and surveying ever used for the purposes of collecting taxes accurately? Now the answer is still provisional because I'm still working on this project. But my hunch is that the reason we don't have a lot of state-sponsored fiscal maps that come before the British is because it was always the local guy, the local thekedar, the local land revenue contractor who kept the maps of the maybe just one village that was under his jurisdiction that he had to deliver to the superior official. Now, if he gives his map of that village to the superior official, he loses his importance, he loses his control, he loses his ability to fleece, his 10%. So mapping is going on, but it remains very, very local, and no ruler in India before the British is able to mobilize that fiscal mapping which is happening in every village, in every district, and to take it to the level of a centralized mapping system. Right? So you will have a lot of astronomical mapping that is happening for the purposes of navigation, for the purposes of astrologers are also going to do the Shubha, the finding the appropriate day for leaving on a journey. So they will also map your journey for you. They'll tell you where you need to go. There are a lot of also local people who will guide travelers, caravans, armies through difficult or dangerous terrain. They also have forms of maps that they have available to them. But that knowledge never gets centralized until the British. So mapping is being done in many, many different ways, sometimes with surveying, with astronomy, with mathematical calculation, but that does not become centralized, and that is why we have such a variety of ways of mapping in India. They do not become standardized and they remain very local, and that's why they look so different. Like, why is this so different from some of the Malamni Pothis that they are published? And when you leaf through the pages of the volume, you'll see that diversity of mappings.
I have a question to you, and that is, in all your research, are you kind of finding that there was a division of labor? Because I remember reading in the old Kerala literature that a sponsor would, patronize a journey out for trade, a ship goes and all of that. But there was another specific guy who was hired to be the navigator. And the Brahmin was the one who had all the astronomy and astrology knowledge, but refused to cross the oceans. So there was another character who was the specialist navigator. Have you come across anything like that?
Yes. Firstly, there were Brahmins who crossed the ocean. So this idea that Brahmins never did is not true. They did. Other upper castes also did cross the ocean. Now, with Kerala, I would have to look up the details because that's not my field of study. But you certainly have, and here's where again I think Indian knowledge systems are so interesting, because there's such a lot of interchange of knowledge between various groups and castes and communities, and mapping most of all. So if you have a mathematician or an astronomer who will calculate the panchang for you, which will be a calendrical system, will include coordinates of various places. That information does not necessarily. So you have a lot of transfer of information, but you also have a lot of roadblocks between the transfer of information. Now, does that information get across to the sailors who are crossing the sea? Maybe, maybe not. We have to look very specifically at individual sailors and individual maps to see whether there is some sort of a mathematical calculation of coordinates and distances in, say, navigational treatises. The astrolabe, I think, gives us a very, very concrete and material way of tracing how knowledge is both being produced and transferred. Because where are astrolabes being produced? Who are these guys producing them? Because, brass craftspeople are often Dalits who are illiterate. So how are they producing these very finely tuned instruments, right? Who is sitting with them and giving them the information to create these astrolabes? How are maps being made, even these? Like the painters, the Matani Pachedi painters belong to the Chitera or Chitara community, who are again of kind of intermediate or low castes. But the information that they need is often not is given to them by Jain Muni, right? So there are kind of very specific transfers of knowledge, but there are also some roadblocks that we have to try to understand as to why that does not become a sort of systematic forms of cartography, why they are not built upon by succeeding generations, why they remain often very local and don't translate outside the regions. So please join me in studying cartography from other parts of India.
Yes, please. Yeah, in front.
I had a question earlier, but it keeps getting lost in your answer. Sorry. So given that you just said, I'll ask a very specific question now, because I think do you think that we're being a bit revivalist in that we're talking a lot about Indian knowledge and informants for the colonial process, and I think we are looking a lot at colonial maps, but I'd like to ask Samira, do you think that maybe we are perhaps in compensation for an earlier way of writing history where the British explorers and the Orientalists were the heroic discoverers of all this knowledge, that now we're pushing back to talk about Brahmin astrologers who had the local knowledge, whether in Kerala or Gujarat? Or did British rule signify a fundamental break in mapping practices that were scientific, so-called, and that we were not scientific? I mean, there are many things happening in this whole discussion which are wonderful, but the earlier Matthew Edney or the other scholars of the mapping of British India would have perhaps projected a more what you would say heroic or elitist conception of how the entire subcontinent was mapped. But there was something about that which was that the entire science of geography globally simply would not have been possible without the possession of British India as a testing ground for these tools that then spread to other parts of the empire. I mean, even in Bombay, if you see, between 1872 with Colonel Lawton's survey and 1919, which is the W.J. Newland survey, both of these are surveyors who are sent by the Survey of India, but Colonel Lawton is a maritime. I mean, they already have a huge break between 1872 and 1919. Huge, technologically, in every way. We've gone from sail to steam, we've gone from we have real scientific maps. So just going back to everything you've shown, latitude, the determination thereof, longitude, which determines what time zone you're in, which becomes much later, that we have Indian Standard Time only by the turn of the century, but the ability for astrologers to turn astronomical knowledge into geographic knowledge prior to the advent of colonialism. What's happening? Do you think that British rule was a fundamental break, science, mapping, cartography, and what we get in our phones today? So I felt, just to end, we seem to be interested in how iconography becomes cartography, becomes geography, becomes what we see on our phones. No, that's a process that the question of periodization is there. If you go into the 14th century, then we're jumping to the 19th century, then we're talking about Google Maps. This is a process that unfolds through countries and knowledge systems and unequal knowledge relations. So who is winning? Are we winning? I don't know. I don't know what my question is here. That's how we frame things now. Are we winning? Did they win? Or did they win?
So I'll answer very briefly to say that British mapping systems are a fundamental shift from what goes before, because the British, from Rennell to the trigonometric survey, the idea is to comprehensively map land, but through that to make geography transparent. In other words, to harness geography and to systematize it and to turn it into something that every bureaucrat can access. Right? So it becomes a universalizing system of the production of geographic knowledge. That has never happened before that time. So there is a very dramatic shift with Rennell and the trigonometric survey. So what I'm trying to say is that while elements of that, the basic technologies, the mathematical, the astronomical technologies may have been present, but they are never harnessed by states to even a fraction of the extent to which Rennell, etc.
But did Arab explorers or Sanskrit Pandits have a term for latitude? Latitude is a completely modern term, right? The determination of the axis.
No. It's a very old term.
So again, it's being a bit, presentist or whatever. The other place to use the term latitude.
No, I think, can I give you my take on this? I feel for the longest time, maps were about understanding how the lay of the land was for me to get from point A to point B, where the main motivation was largely around trade. It has been trade that has been the driving force. When it became converted into documenting the empire and understanding the boundaries of the empire is when you start getting into this format of very elaborate, trigonometrical surveys and maths-based, The other ones are largely to get information to facilitate trade. As for longitude, latitude and all, that's very, very old. Long predates the British.
Also, I just want to add that I know that you're asking a very specific question, but I think what we're also trying to do is sort of highlight the fact that it is not about one person winning. And that it didn't just, no, like, it's not about the like, it did take a lot. So I think what we're trying to highlight is that while the scientific mapping happened, and yes, it was a shift, it also happened as a result of a lot of workforce that included a lot of these disciplines that were already harboring in India before that. So I feel like that's exactly the question we need to rephrase as to it's not just one person or like one entity that made this happen. I think even in the trigonometrical survey, if you sort of go ahead and read a lot of the accounts, there's a lot of politics that is going into the way the trigonometrical survey is also being reported.
No, and you're decentralizing the history writing, which is good now. Because so much of the history of exploration is about European conquest of time and space. Right?
So I think the fact that, and the fact that they talk about the fact that there were these people that they called Indian computers, ORS, Radhanath Sikdar who did the mapping of Everest, all of that was Indian knowledge. So which is why I feel like that's exactly what we need to do and the questions we should.
William Dalrymple, in one of his talks, mentioned that the Roman Empire was actually financed by their trade with India. So there was a huge amount of trade going on between Rome and India, even thousands of years ago. My question is two. One is, there was no steam engine. How did they drive these ships? And was the way they drove the ships effective? And secondly, there was no modern port handling equipment. How were these huge tons of goods loaded onto the ships and unloaded from the ships?
Yeah. I think, first and foremost, it's not the 1 million, dead weight ships that we are talking about. These are smaller format ships for the longest time made near Calicut. Even today when you go, you can see these elaborate dhows that are made there, and that's the same technology that's been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, if you look at the Periplus, they talk about how boats would gather at Berenike. 140 boats were gathering. That's one of the numbers that is quoted. And they would wait for what was then termed as the Hippalus winds, And the Hippalus was the terminology for essentially what we identify today as the monsoon winds. So the monsoon wind would come, and then they would say that it was a fairly straightforward and very efficient journey powered by wind, So it was sailboats mainly, and they would come. And some would go into Gujarat, some would go down south into Kerala and to the many ports. They would hit Maldives on the way, they would hit Lakshadweep on the way. All of that would happen. But it is, it's not, machines. And then they would stay put in these port cities till the reverse northeast monsoons came. And that allowed for 3 months of gathering. So if you're looking for pepper, you have to source the pepper. You have to get enough of it, keep it in the warehouse, then, load it in your boat and take it back. So it gave them that time. So they used the winds to come in and they used the winds to go back.
Even for the trade.
Yeah.
Just to add to that, so yes, the recent research suggests that the 25% of the economy of Roman Egypt was based on the customs duties on the goods that came from India. And one of the important things to remember is also that the Periplus tells us about the Roman ships. They're coming from Roman Egypt to India, but it tells us less about the Indian ships that are going to Roman Egypt. And we have up to 60-ton ships that are going to Roman Egypt, which are coming from the west coast of India. The bulk trade of it was largely textiles, was largely cotton. So cotton would be in bales, it would be transported onto the ships in similar to bales that we see now. And that is a similar kind of way the Indian cotton was really what was the engine of the Arabian Sea trade.
We were very good at carrying weights. We were very good at carrying weights. We had innovative techniques to do that. If you see the 80-ton stone on top of the Brihadeshwara, with no clasps, no clamps, it was taken, one single rock which is 80 tons to place on top of the temple. We knew how to transport. A bale of cotton is...
The pioneer for these imports were mainly Arabs actually.
Yeah.
In fact, see, most of the Maharashtrian imports also, most of the others are descendants of Arabs.
Yeah, in fact, some of the professional mapping that happened in medieval ages was courtesy the Abbasid Caliph Mamun, who actually put out a mandate to a wide swathe of Arab, cartographers who then mapped. And in fact, there's a beautiful little reel done by Shashi Tharoor about how Islam came to Kerala versus how Islam came to the northern part of the country.
In fact, Islam was son of an Arab.
Yeah.
Their great grandson. They came from by boat, most of them. And they came peacefully. The other Muslims came as more as conquerors. And most of them live very, how many generations?
Yeah, but some of the greatest cartographers were Arab, Middle Eastern.
Waiting for a very long time. So maybe conversation we can do later. There's someone who's been waiting for a question for...
Yeah, just get the mic at the back, please.
Mic is here. They need support of backbencher.
Terribly sorry, I didn't want to be of any hindrance for that conversation, but just a very fundamental query. This is with respect to Mr. Sadanand, who's been mentioned ad nauseum throughout this session. How much of a knowledge do you think that he possessed with respect to latitudes and longitudes? Because the map that James Reynolds seems to have rendered is quite eerily similar to the one that we have now, the one that we refer to with respect to the subcontinent, right? And this was prior to the trigonometric survey that you've been speaking about at length. So what would have been the surrogate for latitudes and longitudes? I'm sure you would have mentioned it in passing through in this session, but I might have missed it. And second off, on a lighter note, if the local Subedars were responsible primarily for their constituency and the maps that constituted of their constituency, do you believe that there would have been a fair bit of gerrymandering that would have happened for them to collect their tithes? And just a third question, you needn't answer this because I'm taking a bit of liberty here. I'm from the southern part of the country and we've heard a great deal about Pericles of Erythraean Sea. So how effective was it back in the day, and what do you think led for them to have come up with such a descriptive account of the subcontinent and Africa back in the day when they didn't possess the necessary technology to come up with such descriptive maps, meandering maps, laying out just how the world would have been back in the day?
Okay.
I know that's a lot,
I'll try very quickly. Also, to go back to Shekhar's point, in the Gujarati mapping, they don't use the term latitude. There is a term which is escaping my brain right now, but it translates to stellar altitude. So, in other words, it is the angle of you on the ground with respect to the pole star, which amounts to all practical purposes to the latitude. But the term is not used, the latitude is not used. Longitude is a whole other question. And in the case of Sadanand's map from early 1780s, it doesn't have a specific date. I'm still figuring out what longitude system he uses, whether he is copying or adapting it from European maps.
much so longitudinal determination was what the British were better at and this was
Yes.
why they could crack
But Sadanand, there are some technical issues here because he's using two longitude systems in the same map. So the question is, I'm still figuring it out, what he's trying to do here. Second question, I've forgotten, but the third question.
The second question was whether there would have been a fair bit of gerrymandering that would have happened.
Yes, absolutely. Total, always there. Gerrymandering. So here's where the transparency the British introduce in the surveying of land is necessary because they want to try to stamp out the so-called gerrymandering, right? But that is what leads to the decentralization of power in Indian political systems before the British. British don't like this because they want the revenue to come straight from the ground to the East India Company, right? So they want to stamp out gerrymandering, but gerrymandering is totally part of Indian political systems. Short answer. Third question, how did the Romans know about the coast of Western India? Well, they traveled to it all the time. I mean, we are talking about hundreds of ships every year.
So it was simply empirical observation. Right?
So in this case, yes, the periplus gives us a lot of empirical observations, and the reason is that Indian goods were very highly prized. So what happens is that the Roman officials, the government officials in Roman Egypt say, damn it, we are paying way too much for these Indian goods. I mean, why is there so much of a fashion for these Indian goods? Stop coveting Indian goods. But because there was so much customer demand, they kept having to go and get these Indian goods. And therefore, these are not easy seas to travel. If you want to get to Bharuch, which is the port I know most about, it's very difficult to navigate into Bharuch. But you still have 100 ships a year going to Bharuch from Alexandria to gather these goods. Cotton, spices, Chinese goods, a lot of perfumes. And that's because there was demand. So it's a simple supply-demand issue that creates a lot of empirical observation.
Right. And just another thing, how was the map inferred by the Britishers when it was started by Saddam? I mean, is that possible?
Longer question, longer answer. I will.
Hi, Samira. Very briefly, you mentioned Rambaline. Can you please tell us more about that? Rambaline.
Oh, have an example. Because in that map, it's not actually.
Okay, thank you.
Better map.
Okay, I think we're getting to the point in the evening where informal conversations might be easier, but I just wanted to ask you for a big round of applause for this panel. Thank you. Thank you, Benita, for also steering us. Thank you very much for coming. And before we end, I just wanted to say a big thank you to the Sarmaya team, to Komal, Pallavi, all of them, and to Juhi, who's been standing here all evening. She's actually part of Deepti and Sangamitra's team, who was an absolute pillar while we were working on the book as well. And thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.